I have spent 41 years assessing damage. That is not a poetic way of putting it. It is a precise one. Marine insurance, tidal salvage, hull integrity after storm events. That was my working life, and the habit of it never fully left me, even after I cleared my desk at Hartley & Sons, and handed back the car key, and was given a decanter I didn't need, by men whose handshakes I barely remembered. You spend 4 decades learning to read what the sea does to things, to metal and timber and rope, to hulls and pilings and the faces of men who have watched a vessel go down. And eventually, you stop needing to be at the water to do it. You read everything that way. You sit across from a person at a dinner table, and you are already calculating the stresses, the load-bearing points, the places where the structure might eventually give. It is not a warm way to move through the world. My wife Margaret told me so often enough, and with a patience that I have only fully appreciated in the years since she died, when the habit of cool assessment has had no one to temper it, and has hardened somewhat, the way metal hardens in cold conditions. She was right, as she was right about most things, and I have the good sense to know it now that she is no longer here to say it. She would have known what to make of the evening I am describing. She always knew what to make of the evenings that undid me. She had a gift for it, a quickness of feeling that I lacked, and she would have found the words for it in the car on the way home, talking in the dark with her coat still on. I have had to find them slowly, over several weeks, and I'm not certain I've found them yet. All of which is to explain what I was doing, on the evening of the 12th of April, standing alone at the tall window of the old harbourmaster's building on Alderton Quay, with a glass of warm white wine I wasn't drinking, and my back turned to 50-odd guests, and a speeches program that had run a full 20 minutes over its advertised close. I was looking at the river. The Alderton estuary at night in spring has a quality I have known for most of my adult life, and still cannot entirely account for. The tide coming in off the sea, the channel markers swaying their small lights in the current, the dark shape of the old ferry landing on the far bank with its timber posts still upright after God knows how many decades of tidal scour, the way the lights of the far bank boat sheds lay in long, irregular reflections across the black water. It is not beautiful in any obvious or agreeable way. It is more serious than that. It is the beauty of something functional, something that has been doing exactly what it was built to do for so long, that the purpose and the form have become inseparable. A marine assessor's eye sees all of that, and prices it, automatically, without being asked. I was pricing the old ferry landing, estimating what it would cost to restamp and reinforce if the Harbor Trust ever got around to it, the timber posts and the iron cleats and the concrete apron above the tide line, when I became aware of someone standing near me. Not next to me. Near me, by the short upright piano in the corner of the function room, which I had noticed earlier only as a piece of furniture slightly in the way of the catering table. The man standing near it was not any of the suited and gowned figures I had been half watching over the course of the evening. He was broad-shouldered and sun-darkened in a way that the room's other occupants were not, wearing a dark jacket that sat on him, the way borrowed clothes sometimes do on men whose daily dress is more practical, not ill-fitting, but not native to him either. His hair was white and cut close, and his hands, which rested at his sides, were large and knuckled in the manner of hands that have worked outdoors through many winters. He was looking at the piano with an expression I could not immediately read, not longing exactly, and not calculation, something else, something that had come to rest. I recognized him. Not personally. I had been away from Alderton for the better part of a decade while Margaret's mother needed us in Exeter, and had only returned to the town 3 years past, as a widower. But I had seen him on the river. He ran one of the 2 remaining passenger ferries on the Alderton crossing, the flat-bottomed wooden vessel that made its way back and forth between the quay and the far landing every half hour through the summer season, and less frequently through the winter, carrying dog walkers and cyclists, and the occasional tourist who had read about the estuary in a guidebook, and was now slightly puzzled by the reality of it, which was quieter and more serious than the guidebook suggested. I had taken the crossing twice since my return, once alone in a gray October, once with my daughter Clara and her 2 children at Christmas, when the children had been thrilled by a seal that surfaced briefly alongside the bow and then disappeared, and both times he had been at the tiller, a steady and unhurried figure who seemed entirely at his ease with the water and the weather and the particular quality of silence that gathers on an estuary at the turn of a tide. He did not make conversation on the crossing, I recalled, But neither did he ignore his passengers. He simply attended to what he was doing: the tiller, the engine, the channel markers, the changing color of the water, with the complete and quiet competence of a man who knows exactly where he is and what the water requires of him. Clement Oakes, I believed his name was. I had seen it on the little painted signboard at the quay steps, underneath the faded Alderton Ferry service lettering. Clement Oakes, Prop Est, 1993. I had not imagined he would be at this evening's gala. The occasion was a fundraising dinner for the Harbour Restoration Program, specifically the renovation of the old Harbour Master's building in which we were now standing, a Georgian structure that had served the working harbour for nearly 2 centuries before it fell into a decade of expensive dereliction, its windows boarded, its roof failing, its magnificent riverside frontage slowly being reclaimed by the salt air and the weather and the indifferent patience of estuary winters. The Harbour Trust had raised enough, after 11 years of effort, to begin the restoration, and the building was now repaired and replastered and freshly painted, its tall riverside windows restored, its function room fitted out with round tables and white linen for 120 covers. Tonight's dinner was the formal opening celebration, a fundraiser for the second phase of restoration work, and the room was full of the kind of people who attend such occasions: retired naval officers in their medals, local business owners in their better suits, a number of yacht club members in that particular state of comfortable self-satisfaction that comes with having donated to something visible and being seen to have done so. The speeches had been about legacy and community and the importance of maritime heritage, and they had been perfectly fine, and I had listened to all of them with the professional attentiveness of a man who has spent a career in meetings, and then I had come to stand at the window with my wine because the room had begun to feel warm, and I was tired of standing near people I did not know well enough to speak to honestly. The piano in the corner was a Bechstein upright, I learned later, donated to the building by the estate of its last private occupant, a widow who had lived here for the final years of her life and had presumably played it in the evenings looking out at the estuary. It had been tuned in preparation for the gala. I noticed later that one of the programs mentioned a brief musical interlude between the speeches and the pudding course, but so far no one had touched it. It stood in the corner with the bearing of something that expected eventually to be used. Clement Oakes was looking at it with the expression of a man who knows an instrument. I was certain of this even before what followed, though I could not have explained precisely how. There is a difference between the way a person looks at a piano they cannot play and the way a person looks at a piano they can. A difference in the quality of the attention, in whether the looking is curiosity or recognition. Clement Oakes's looking was recognition. He was not reading the instrument. He was greeting it. It was Reginald Frome who noticed him. I had been aware of Frome all evening, in the way one is aware of a large vessel moving at speed through a crowded harbor. You do not need to watch it closely to know it is the thing most likely to create a disturbance. Frome was the Commodore of the Alderton Harbour Authority and the Associated Sailing Club, a position he occupied with the unshakable certainty of a man who had never seriously considered that any other arrangement was possible. He was 65 or thereabouts, well-fed in the manner of prosperity, with the kind of large assurance that accrues over decades of being the person who decides things, in rooms like this one, who speaks at the beginning of evenings and the end of them, who moves between tables with the ease of a man who expects to be welcome, and generally is. He was not, so far as I could determine over the course of the evening, a bad man. He was simply a man who had never quite had to imagine himself into another person's perspective, and who had arrived at late middle age without noticing that this was unusual, because the world he operated in had never required it of him. He was holding court near the bar with 4 or 5 yacht club members, recounting what sounded like a sailing anecdote, when he turned, and his gaze found Clement Oakes standing by the piano, and something in the image, the broad-shouldered working man in the borrowed jacket, standing before the polished Bechstein in the corner of the Harbour Authority's function room, appeared to strike him as an opportunity of some kind. Frome had that quality. He was quick to find opportunities for a remark that would entertain, that would draw people to him, that would confirm the room's sense of ease and informality. He was good at it. It was one of the things that made him effective in the position he held, and it was not his fault, I think, that the instinct operated on this occasion without sufficient thought as to the landing. "Oakes," he said, loudly enough that the word carried to most of the room. He smiled as he said it, the warm, including smile of a man who considers himself on easy terms with everyone, regardless of whether the easiness is mutual. Since our ferryman seems so drawn to the instrument, give us something simple, would you? Something nautical, perhaps. He laughed as he said it, a generous laugh, the kind that expects the room to join it, and the room did. The comfortable, good-natured laughter of people who are with the man who made the joke, and not yet with the man the joke was made at. There was nothing in it that was intended to wound. I am certain of that. It was intended to include, in the way of a man who believes that drawing attention to someone is the same thing as including them. It was the kind of remark that assumes, without quite knowing that it is assuming, that there is a natural order to these occasions, that a ferryman standing near a piano is a pleasant irregularity in that order, a gentle comedy, something to fill the moment warmly before the pudding plates arrived. I watched Clement Oakes hear it. He was looking at the piano when Frome spoke, and he did not immediately look away from it. He did not look at Frome. He did not look at the room. He stood with his hands at his sides for perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, the kind of pause that a man acquires when he has spent a great deal of time on water, where patience is not a virtue but a practical necessity, where hurrying serves nothing, and the tide does what the tide does regardless. Then he pulled out the piano stool. He looked at it for a moment, made a small adjustment to its position relative to the keyboard, and sat down. The laughter had not quite finished. Some of it was still circulating at the bar end of the room, the tail of the joke not yet arrived at the ears of the people nearest the door. It was still there, ambient, as Clement Oakes placed his hands on his thighs for a moment and looked at the keyboard, not staring at it. Not performing the looking for the benefit of anyone watching, simply looking, the way a man looks at something before he begins a piece of work that requires his full attention, a brief and private reckoning, a settling of accounts between himself and what he was about to do. He reached down and adjusted the height of the stool with 2 deliberate quarter turns of the height screw, not groping for the adjustment, finding it directly, without looking at the mechanism, as a person finds a thing they have found 10,000 times before. Then he placed his fingers on the keys. I am a man who spent 41 years with numbers and reports, with photographs of damage and actuarial tables, and the cool, specific language of salvage and assessment. I do not have the musical vocabulary to tell you, with the precision I would prefer, what I heard in the next 6 or 7 minutes. What I can tell you is this: I have been trying to account for it ever since, in the way one tries to account for an event whose category is not yet clear, approaching it from different angles, applying different frameworks, finding each time that the measurement tool is wrong for the thing being measured. What happened in the restored function room of the old Harbour Master's building on the Alderton Quay on the 12th of April was not within the scope of my available instruments. I can only tell you what I observed. The first notes fell into the room like something arriving from the river. That is not a poetic way of putting it, or not only a poetic way. It is what happened, and the image is accurate. Not dramatic, not loud, not sudden, not a statement of intent. The opposite. 3 notes in the bass, low and evenly spaced. A slow triplet pattern that established itself beneath everything that followed as a ground, an undertow, a place below the surface where the music had its foundations. They arrived without announcement, settling into the space the way water settles into a basin, without hurry, without force, entirely certain of its right to be there. And above that bass, when it came, a melody. I will not attempt to describe the melody in technical terms, because I do not have them, and because I think in any case, technical terms would be the wrong tool for what I am trying to convey. What I will say is that it arrived above the patient bass, with a quality of unhurried gravity that was entirely unlike anything I expected to hear in that room, at that moment, from those hands. It was slow. It was deeply and evenly unhurried, moving through its phrases at a pace that seemed to have been set not by convention, but by something interior, by the speed at which the music itself needed to breathe, to open, to say whatever it had to say. There was a gentleness in it that was not the same thing as softness. The gentleness of deep water is not soft. It is patient and indifferent, and entirely confident in its own power. The melody had that quality. The laughter in the room stopped. I did not notice it stopping in the moment. I only noticed, a moment afterward, that it had stopped. The way you notice a sound has ended only in its absence. It was not a gradual cessation. It was sudden, or nearly so. The way a weather system changes not slowly, but in the space between two consecutive moments. One moment the room had its ambient noise, the murmur of the bar end, the settling sound of people adjusting in chairs, the small percussive sounds of an evening gathering, and then it did not, and what replaced it was a quality of attention so absolute and so unanimous that it was almost a physical presence, something you could feel at the back of your neck. The people near the bar had turned. The people at the tables had put down their glasses. Two women from the catering company, who had been moving between the tables collecting first-course plates, had both stopped, their arms at their sides, and were looking at the corner where Clement Oakes sat. I had not moved from the window. I was closer to the piano than anyone else in the room, 5 or 6 feet away, near enough to see his hands on the keys, and it was his hands that I kept returning to throughout, because they were not what I expected, and I could not stop trying to account for them. They were the same hands I had noticed when he was standing by the piano. Large, weathered, the knuckles prominent at the joints in the way of hands that have gripped a tiller handle and handled rope and engine machinery through many winters in open water. Hands that looked as though they belonged to a particular and demanding physical life. And yet the way they moved on the keyboard had none of the tentativeness that I would have expected from those hands. They moved with the ease of something that has long since ceased to require thought, finding each note not by search but by arrival, the body knowing where to go before the mind has formulated the instruction. I thought, watching them, these are not a ferryman's hands at the piano, these are a pianist's hands. I did not know yet how to account for the two things being the same hands. The melody moved above the slow, steady bass notes like something drifting on current. I am aware that I am returning to the water image, and I am aware that it may seem convenient, that a marine assessor describing music in terms of the sea may appear to be reaching for his only available vocabulary, but the image is accurate, and I will stand by it. The music had that quality, something suspended, afloat, subject to invisible forces, and it had, beneath the suspension, the authority of deep water, the sense that the thing is much larger than what you can see of it on the surface, that the surface is simply the edge of something whose full extent goes down to places you cannot see. There was a passage, perhaps a third of the way through, where the melody lifted into a slightly higher phrase, lighter, and more tentative than what had come before, the way a question lifts at the end of its asking. It was at this moment that I became aware of the room changing, not merely in its attention, but in its character. I noticed the woman at the table nearest the piano. She was in her mid-60s, with the composed expression of someone accustomed to managing her own reactions in public, and she was not managing this one. Her hand had come up to her sternum, not a dramatic gesture, not a performance, simply a hand pressing against a bruise, an involuntary motion of the body responding before the mind had caught up with what was happening. I noted it the way I note things, clinically, precisely. And then I looked away from her because it felt like an intrusion, because what was on her face was private and not intended for me, and because I had enough of my own to attend to. I will tell you what I had. Margaret had been dead for 3 years and 2 months, and I had been careful, very careful, in the marine assessor's way, about when and where I allowed myself to miss her. The care was a practical necessity for a man who lives alone, and also a way of not fully living that I was aware of, but had found no adequate alternative to. The watch checking, the evenings at the window looking at rivers, the pricing of timber posts, a systematic approach to grief, attentive to tolerances, manageable within the structure of a working day that no longer existed. The gymnopédie, in the hands of Clement Oakes, went underneath all of it. Directly underneath, the way deep water moves below the surface of a thing, finding the foundations, testing what they are made of. The music did not announce itself. It did not say, "Here is what you should feel." It arrived and it kept arriving, phrase by phrase, and each phrase opened slightly further than the one before it, and the room opened with it, and there was nothing effortful about any of it. It was simply happening, the way the tide happens, not because anyone decided it would, but because the conditions were right and the water had somewhere to go. I looked at Frome. He was standing very still near the bar. The wine glass that had been in his hand when he made the remark about the ferryman was no longer in his hand. I noticed this without seeing him set it down, which meant he had done it quietly, which was not his habitual manner of doing things. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at Clement Oakes with an expression that I had not seen on Frome's face at any point during the evening, and which I found difficult to name. It was not shame, exactly. Shame implies a knowledge of wrongdoing, and I do not think Frome had arrived at knowledge yet, or if he had, it had arrived so recently that it was still being processed. What was on his face was something more elemental than that. It was the expression of a man who has said something he believed he understood and has found, suddenly, that he understood nothing about it. The large assurance that was Frome's default mode had gone quiet. The room had gone quiet, and in the room's quiet, Frome had gone quiet too, and what remained on his face was simply a man, stripped of his position and his habits, hearing something he had no defenses against. None of us did. That is what I have kept returning to, in the weeks since, trying to understand what happened, and why it happened, with the completeness it did. The music did not pick its way through our particular weaknesses and find us where we were vulnerable. Or rather, it did not need to, because we were all vulnerable in the same place. The place in a person where the things they have lost live, where the things they are afraid of losing live alongside the things they have already lost and have not entirely finished grieving. The music went directly there, without asking permission, without explaining what it intended to do. It simply arrived and found the room full of people who had, each of them, something in that place, and the finding was very quiet and very thorough, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Clement Oakes was not playing for the room. I understood this clearly, watching him. He was not performing the music, he was playing it, which is a different thing. Performing requires an audience. Playing requires only the music, and the instrument, and the person at the center of both. He was at the center of both. His eyes were not closed. I noted this and kept noting it throughout, because I expected them to be, and they were not, but they were looking at the middle distance above the keys, at a point in the air that was not the room, and not the window, and not anything I could locate. He was somewhere else. He was somewhere the music was coming from and going to at the same time, in the way of things that have been carried inside for a very long time, and are finally being set down in a space large enough to hold them. The piece moved through its middle section, the melody returning in a slightly varied form, richer and deeper, and with more weight in the bass, and I was aware of time having ceased to mean what it usually means. I check my watch with the regularity of a man who spent his career accountable to tidal schedules and weather windows, and I did not check it once. This is more remarkable than it sounds. I have not, in my recollection, failed to check my watch for a period of more than 30 minutes since my retirement, and I had been at the window looking at the river for at least that long before the music started. But from the moment Clement Oakes placed his fingers on the keys, the question of what time it was ceased to present itself as a question worth asking. The only time was the time of the music, which moved at its own pace, which was not indifferent to the people in the room, but was not, primarily, for them. I am aware that I am circling the most important thing rather than going directly to it. This is a habit of marine insurance, where the most important thing, the extent of the damage, the cost of the loss, is approached gradually and from multiple directions, so that by the time you arrive at the number, it is already supported on all sides by evidence and cannot be disputed. I will go directly to it now. Halfway through the performance, and I am estimating the halfway point from what I now know of the piece's structure, having listened to it several times since that evening, in my kitchen at night with the lights low, I began to cry. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone would have noticed from more than 2 feet away. I am a man of 71, who has buried his wife and his partner of 38 years, and several people he cared about, and I have been present at the kinds of events that require the management of public emotion, and I have managed it. I am mentioning this not to establish credentials in stoicism, but to indicate that what happened at the harbor master's building was not an ordinary occasion of my crying, because on an ordinary occasion I would have managed it, and on this one I could not. My eyes filled. I pressed the heel of my hand against my mouth, which is a gesture I apparently make when I am trying not to make a sound, and which I was not aware of making until I noticed that my hand was there. I looked at the river, and the river was blurred and dark, and the channel lights were bent in my vision, and I did not move from the window, because moving would have required a decision, and I was incapable of decisions. I was only capable of hearing. There is a thing Margaret used to say when she was moved by music, by a piece on the radio or at a concert. The occasions when I would notice her expression change and become private in the way it became private when she was feeling something she had not expected. She would say, "It reached the part that doesn't have a name." I understood, abstractly, what she meant. I did not know what she meant, not really, not from the inside, until the April evening on the Alderton Quay. The gymnopédie went to the part that doesn't have a name, the part where the grief that doesn't have a specific object lives, the grief that is not for any particular person or thing, but for the fact of loss itself, for the fact of time, for the fact that the people and the evenings and the crossings and the years accumulate and recede, and what you have at the end is the river running dark under the lights, and the tide doing what tides do, and the absolute certainty that you are very glad you were there for it, and also that you are not anywhere near finished grieving it. The final passage of the gymnopédie is a return. The opening phrase comes back. The same slow bass, the same patient ground, the melody re-arriving, as if it has been somewhere, and has now come home. I know this now, having listened to it since. In the moment, I did not know it was a return. I only knew that the music was arriving again from a direction I had not expected, with the accumulated weight of everything that had come before it, and that the accumulated weight was considerable, and that the room and I were not equal to it. The return arrived the way the tide arrives at the Alderton estuary on a flood, not with drama, not with announcement, with complete and inevitable authority, filling every available space in the room, and then, it seemed, a little more. He held the final chord. He held it for 7 or 8 seconds, long enough for the tone to begin to thin in the bass, and then to resolve, in the treble, into the specific quality of silence that a room holds when it has received something and does not yet know how to respond to it. It is a different silence from ordinary silence. I know ordinary silence, the silence of an empty office, of a survey ship at anchor, of my house in the months after Margaret died. This was not that. This was a full silence, a silence with weight and presence, a silence that the room was actively maintaining, each person in it holding the same still breath, because they did not want to be the one who broke it. I counted. 17 seconds. I noted the number later, in the car on the way home, when I was trying to reconstruct the events of the evening with the precision of a damage report, and I noted that I had not decided to count. I had simply counted, the way a man counts who has spent a career measuring intervals and windows and tidal periods, doing it without volition. 17 seconds of the full silence, and then the woman with her hand on her chest began to applaud. She did it quietly, the way a person does a thing when they are not entirely in control of the doing of it. Her hands came together once, twice, and then the sound spread, because that is the nature of such things. It spreads the way a disturbance spreads on open water, outward from the point of impact in rings, each ring carrying the energy of the one before. The applause rose, table by table, from the nearest to the window backward, toward the bar and the door, and I was standing before I was aware of having stood, and the wine glass I had been holding was somewhere behind me on the windowsill, and I was clapping, which I noted without being able to account for it, since I am not by inclination a man who claps. People were standing, the room was standing, not all at once, in the progressive, unrehearsed way of genuine responses rather than performed ones. I am aware that the phrase standing ovation has been reduced by overuse to a descriptor for the ordinary, applied to adequate performances at school concerts and corporate awards evenings, and I want to be precise. What happened in the function room of the old harbor master's building was not that. It was not the reflex of an audience fulfilling a social expectation. It was 50-odd people getting to their feet because remaining seated had ceased to feel like an adequate response to what had just happened to them. The difference is not a small one. Reginald Frome was the last person in the room to stand. I watched this happen. I want to be clear that I was watching it, and that what I saw was real, and not the product of any prior wish about how the evening should conclude. Frome stood when there was essentially no one left sitting, when remaining seated would have required a deliberate act of opposition. He stood slowly, without ceremony, and he put his hands together, and he clapped, and the clapping was real, genuine, sustained, not perfunctory or obligatory, but he did not speak. He had, I noticed, retrieved his wine glass from wherever he had set it down, and he held it at his side in the way he had held it throughout the evening, except that he did not raise it. which was the gesture he had made repeatedly during the speeches, when acknowledging a speaker from across the room. He did not raise the glass. He held it at his side and he clapped, and he looked at Clement Oakes from across the room with an expression on his face that I have thought about often in the weeks since, and that I will not attempt to fully characterize, because I think it was a private expression, and because I am not sure I have the right to make it into a story about Frome. I will say only that the large assurance was absent, and that what replaced it on his face was something quieter and more genuine than anything I had seen there during the previous 3 hours of the evening. Clement Oakes stood up from the stool. He turned the height screw back to where it had been, 2 precise quarter turns in reverse, the same deliberateness with which he had adjusted it, and pushed the stool gently in under the keyboard. He straightened up and turned to face the room, and what he wore on his face was not the expression of a man taking a bow, and it was not the expression of a man who is moved, and it was not modesty or pride, or the combination of both that you see on the faces of performers who have done well and know it. It was steadiness. The same steadiness he wore at the tiller of the ferry on the morning crossing, when the water was doing something unpredictable, and there was nothing to be done but hold the course. A steadiness that came not from the absence of feeling, but from the presence of experience. From having been at the place where the feeling lives for long enough that it no longer surprised him. He had played the piece he had played. The room had heard it. That was what had happened. He was accounting for it in the manner he accounted for everything. Then he walked back to his table at the far end of the room, sat down, and picked up his water glass. The applause continued for some time after he sat down. I cannot tell you for how long because I had stopped counting and had gone back to looking at the river, which was still there, still running, the channel buoys still swaying their lights in the current, indifferent, in the most reassuring possible way to everything that had just occurred inside the restored building on its bank. The remaining hour of the gala passed in the way evenings pass after something unrepeatable has happened in the middle of them. With a slightly bewildered warmth, a tenderness that everyone wore on their faces without quite being able to account for it, conversations that kept orbiting what they had heard without quite finding the words for the return. I spoke to the harbour master's assistant, a young woman named Denise who had grown up in Alderton, and to a retired naval commander who had served with someone I vaguely knew from my insurance years, and to the chairman of the Harbour Trust, who was still visibly affected and was making no effort to conceal it, which I found unexpectedly touching in a man of his generation. I ate the pudding course, which was a good lemon tart. I had a second glass of wine, which was considerably better than the first. I did not speak to Clement Oakes. I am not sure why. Partly because he was at the far end of the room, and I did not want to cross the room deliberately for the purpose, in the way one does not want to make a thing into more of a thing than it already is. And partly because what I wanted to say to him was something I had not found the words for yet, and I have learned, after 41 years of writing damage reports, that you are better served by not putting words around something until you have the right ones. It was gone 11 when I found myself outside on the quay steps, my jacket over my arm, looking at the river in the dark. The tide had turned while we were inside. The estuary was on the ebb now, the channel drawing quietly seaward, the water darker and slower at this state of the tide. The air was cold and salt-edged and completely clear, the kind of spring night on an estuary that makes the inside of a function room feel imprecise and faintly absurd, that reminds you what cold is, what open air is, what it is to stand on the edge of something large and tidal and very old. Clement Oakes was at the far end of the quay steps, standing with one hand on the iron railing, looking at the water. He had his jacket on and his collar open, and he was looking at the river the way he had looked at the piano, with an attention that was neither longing nor calculation, but something that had come to rest. I walked along the quay and stopped a few yards from him. He glanced over, registered me, and looked back at the river. We stood for a moment without speaking, in the way of two people who do not know each other well, but have both been in the same room for something that makes ordinary conversational openings feel like the wrong instrument for the job. Marine insurance, I said eventually. 41 years. Mostly the coastal runs and the estuary. Retired now. He nodded at the water. I thought I'd seen you on the crossing. Once in the autumn, I said. Once at Christmas, with my daughter and her children. They liked the seals. Very much. I paused. There were 2. There are 2 that come in on the flood tide, he said, most evenings in the season. They know the schedule better than some of my regular passengers. We were quiet for a moment. The river ran its steady business past the quay steps, the ebb pulling the water seaward, with the quiet authority of something that has been doing exactly this for longer than any of us have been here to watch it. I looked at the dark shape of the ferry landing on the far bank, its timber posts standing in the darkness, and I thought about what I had heard, and about what I still could not entirely account for, and I decided that the words I had were the words I had, and that they would have to be sufficient. "The piece," I said. "The sati." I looked it up on my daughter's telephone afterward. The first gymnopédie. He did not say anything for a long moment. I had the feeling, as I had had with the 17 seconds of silence in the function room, of a man who was not in any hurry, and who was not going to be hurried. "She used to hum it," he said, "on the crossing. In summer, standing at the bow, watching the estuary open out toward the sea." He paused. "My daughter, Maeve. She was 12, the first summer she started coming out on the ferry properly, helping with the ropes, learning the channel markers, how to read the water. She picked things up quietly. She never made a performance of knowing something. She just knew it, and went on." I waited. She heard me playing one evening. I have an old upright in the back room of the cottage, behind the quay, and she said, "That piece sounds like the estuary." I told her I'd taught it to myself years before she was born. She said yes, but you learned it from the water. You learned it from being out here. He was quiet for a moment. I thought she was probably right. She usually was. He was looking at the estuary. The channel buoy nearest the quay was swaying in the ebb current, its light tracing a small unhurried arc in the dark. "She died 4 years ago," he said, "in March. It came quickly, as these things sometimes go. 5 months from the diagnosis." "I'm sorry," I said. "She was 29. He said it without inflection, not because the feeling was absent, but because the feeling was so large and so long established that inflection would have been inadequate to it. I've played the piece most evenings since, in the back room, with the light on, not thinking about it, particularly, just playing it. It was the thing that was there. I understood this in the way of a man who has his own things that are there, who has walked through the same rooms, and made the same cup of tea in the same sequence, and sat in the same chair that was not the right chair, that was always slightly wrong, because the right chair was on the other side of the table, and the table was where it had always been. I understood it as a man who has learned, through necessity, what the things that are simply there are for. It was the first time I'd played it for anyone else, he said, since she died. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have served the moment better than the river and the cold and the dark. We stood at the quay railing for a while longer. The ebb took the channel past us, quiet and purposeful, the water carrying the estuary's business out toward the open sea. The channel buoys swayed their lights. Somewhere on the far bank, a light was on in one of the boat sheds above the old ferry landing, someone working late, or simply a light left on, or the ordinary continuation of things that do not know they are being witnessed. I walked home along the quay at around 11:30. The air was cold and still and clean, and the estuary was dark and moving and entirely itself, as it had been before the gala and would be after it, and long after all of us had finished accounting for anything. I have been back on the crossing 3 times since April. Once alone, in May, on a morning when the light on the estuary was doing something particular with the color of the water, and I wanted to be in it, rather than looking at it from the bank. Once with my brother-in-law Peter, who asked what I was looking at, and I told him I was checking the state of the channel markers, which was not untrue. And once in June, at dusk, when the tide was on the flood and the light was going soft above the far bank, and the water had that quality it has at the end of a warm day, dark and slow and full of itself. Clement Oakes was at the tiller on all 3 occasions. He did not raise the matter of the gala, and I did not raise it, because it did not require raising. What had been said at the quay railing had been said and was sufficient. What had been heard in the function room had been heard and was sufficient. The crossing took 8 minutes and delivered you from one bank to the other with the same steady efficiency it had always done, as if the water between the 2 banks were simply a pause, a place where the 2 sides of a thing are briefly separated by something that knows its own way. On the June evening, as the ferry nudged the far landing and I prepared to step off onto the timber platform, he said, "She was right about it, by the way. If you stay out here long enough, you hear it." I stepped off onto the landing. The old timbers held. I looked back at him, at the broad-shouldered figure at the tiller in the going light, with the estuary opening behind him toward the sea. "She usually was," I said. He put the engine in reverse. The ferry backed off the landing and turned into the channel, and I stood on the far bank in the last of the light and watched it go. The small, flat vessel, moving steadily in the current, finding its line across the water, as it had always found it, as it would find it tomorrow, and the evening after that. The river ran between us, dark and steady, doing what rivers do, going where they go, arriving, always, somewhere. I have listened to the gymnopédie many times since that April evening. In the kitchen late at night, on my daughter's wireless speaker, that she insists I borrow, and which I have not yet returned. In the car on the long drive back from Exeter when I went to settle some of Margaret's mother's remaining affairs. Once at 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark because I had woken from a dream about Margaret and could not return to sleep and needed something other than the sound of the house. Each time I listen, I hear something I have not quite heard before. This is not, I think, because the piece changes. I am fairly certain the piece does not change. It is because I am arriving at it from a different angle each time, from a different state of my own interior, and the piece is indifferent to all of that, and simply offers what it has always offered. The same slow bass, the same patient melody, the same quality of unhurried gravity. It asks nothing of you. It requires only that you stop and listen, and the listening is the thing that changes. On the night I first listened to it at home, 2 days after the gala, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of whiskey I had poured for the purpose, and then not drunk, I was trying to do something I spend a great deal of time doing: understand what had happened. The habit of the damage assessor. Something occurred. Find the cause. Quantify the effect. Arrive at a figure. The figure, in this case, was not expressible in numbers, which is the kind of discovery that ought to be more unsettling to a man of my training than it actually was, now that I am facing it plainly. What I arrived at, over the course of an evening, and several more since, is this. Clement Oakes had carried that music for 4 years the way a person carries something they are not yet ready to set down in public. Not because they are ashamed of it, but because it is too particular, too interior, too much a part of the private accounting between themselves and whoever, or whatever, is no longer there to receive it. He had played it every evening alone, in the back room of the harbour cottage, with the light on and the window facing the quay, and the piece had over those 4 years become something different from what it was when he first learned it. It had become a conversation, a one-sided conversation, in the way of all conversations with people who are no longer here, but a conversation nonetheless, the kind that is conducted not in words, but in the specific language of whatever was shared between the two people. And in Clement Oakes's case, what was shared was the river and the ferry and the sound of an estuary at the turn of a tide, and a piece of music that a 12-year-old girl had once said sounded like all of that. When he sat down at the Bechstein in the function room of the old harbour master's building and placed his fingers on the keys, he was not performing for the 50-odd guests who had fallen silent in their chairs. He was playing for Maeve, as he played for Maeve every evening, in the only language that had remained entirely sufficient since she went. The room simply happened to be in the way of the music. The room simply happened to hear it. And what the room heard, in those 7 minutes or however long it was not a performance of technical mastery, though that was present, unmistakably, but the sound of a private reckoning made suddenly audible, the sound of grief that has been tended for 4 years, with complete consistency, and has consequently developed a depth and a clarity and a precision that grief tended for 1 week, or 3 months, or even 2 years cannot have. That is what entered the room. That is what silenced the laughter. I do not know what Reginald Frome made of the evening in the days that followed. I saw him once, at the end of April, in the car park of the Chandlery, at the far end of the quay, where he was loading rope into the back of his car, and I was buying marine epoxy for a repair to the garden gate that Margaret had been after me to do for approximately 3 years. He saw me, and he raised his chin in acknowledgement, and I raised mine in return, and we did not speak. There was nothing that needed saying between us specifically, but I noticed that the large assurance was slightly different, not diminished exactly, but adjusted. The way a structure is adjusted when someone has properly calculated what it can bear. Perhaps I am reading too much into a man loading rope into a hatchback in a car park. I am aware that the habit of finding significance in things is not always an accurate instrument. But I do not think I am wrong about Frome. What I know with certainty is what happened in the room, and what happened afterward at the quay railing, and what Clement Oakes said to me on the June evening, as the ferry backed off the far landing and the light was going over the estuary. The music that a girl had said sounded like the river. The playing of it, alone, every evening, for 4 years. And then, because a pompous man with a generous laugh had called out across a room without thinking what he was saying, the playing of it, for the first time in front of people who had no right to hear it, and were entirely changed by the hearing. There is something in that sequence that I have been trying to locate in the proper category for several weeks now. The category of marine insurance does not have a term for it. The category of tidal salvage does not have a term for it. The category of grief, which I have spent the last 3 years trying to learn on the job, does not have a term for it either. Or if it does, I have not found it yet. What I have found, and what I am fairly confident is accurate, is this. There are things that are carried for years in silence, carried well, carried with care, carried with the kind of long and patient devotion that working knowledge of the sea teaches, and that most other kinds of life do not, and that the carrying, done long enough and thoroughly enough, gives those things a density, and a weight, and a clarity that makes them, when they are finally set down, legible even to people who had no expectation of reading them. Even to marine assessors standing at windows in restored function rooms, looking at rivers and pricing timber posts, and entirely unprepared for what was about to arrive through the silence. The ferry was nearly at the far bank. I watched it nudge the landing. I watched Clement Oakes put the engine in reverse and hold the vessel steady while the last 2 passengers stepped off. Then he turned back into the channel, and the flat-bottomed hull found its line in the current, and the ebb took it south toward the open water, and then the engine corrected, and the bow came around, and the crossing began again in the other direction. I stood on the quay steps and watched it go, the way I sometimes stand on the quay steps and watch the tide turn, which tells you nothing you didn't already know about the tide but is, somehow, worth watching all the same.